Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the second climate conversation hosted by Woking Borough Council. My name is Gregor Murray. I am executive member for Climate Emergency for Woking Borough. Before we begin, I have a couple of house rules to take you through. The first is that for GDPR reasons, I need to tell you that this session is going to be recorded. Please keep your cameras and your microphones off unless you are one of our speakers. And if you want to ask a question, please use the chat function for this meeting. A couple of the team from Woking Borough Council will be monitoring the chat function throughout, and we'll make sure that all of your questions get put to our panelists later on in the session. Climate Conversations is an informal dialogue that invites you, the residents of Woking Borough and our business community, to take part in discussions about some of the topical issues around climate change. We've invited a panel of speakers who I'll introduce shortly to help us explore some of the challenges and opportunities to achieving net zero carbon in an informal environment where you get to ask questions and listen to what our speakers have to say. And we aim to reach out to our business community, to professionals and to individuals, and talk about the issues that affect them. So things like decarbonisation and also the transition towards the greener economy. Through this dialogue, we want to help connect agendas such as economic development, skills, business issues with the climate emergency, and share some best practice and case studies to help inspire you and help connect the small actions that we can all take to the bigger picture, which is what we need to create. Through this dialogue, we want to help all of you and inspire all of you to take action on your own carbon footprints, and that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. This particular conversation aims to primarily discuss carbon footprinting and the reporting for all audiences alongside the benefits and the challenges. It will inform you why organisations should commit to climate pledges and to reaching net zero, along with the benefits of making a carbon reduction plan. It will also cover some of the options available to address emissions, utilising real case studies from our experts, and demonstrate what steps can be involved and how you can make a start right now. These topics will be explored in more detail in a couple of minutes, but before we do, we're going to run a couple of polls throughout this session. So asking you some questions about yourselves, your own businesses, and what you've been doing. So the first poll, which should come up in the chat very shortly, is about carbon footprinting. So how important do you think carbon footprinting is for local businesses? We'll start with very important, somewhat important, and not important at all. So if you just quickly jump into the chat and take part in that poll, that would be fantastic. And while you're doing that, I will introduce our panel. So our first panelist is Lucy Latham, who is Senior Manager for Cities, States, Regions at CDP. Lucy is the person with the red background. Lucy is Regional Manager for Europe, Middle East and Africa at CDP, previously known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. Her work focuses on supporting accountability and environmental governance for subnational governments, so people like Woking Borough Council ourselves. CDP is a not-for-profit charity that runs the global disclosure systems for investors, companies, cities, states and regions, and manages their environmental impacts for investors or purchasers to access environmental information for use in financial decisions. Climate change, water scarcity and deforestation are unparalleled global challenges that require a systematic change in behaviour. And in response, CDP have built the most comprehensive collection of self-reporting environmental data in the world. Their network of investors' purchases represents $87 trillion, along with policymakers around the globe, use the data and insights to make better informed decisions. Through their offices and partners in 50 countries, they have driven unprecedented levels of environmental disclosure. Lucy McKelvey is a co-founder of Greenfeet. My apologies, Lisa. With experience in assisting organisations ranging from less than 10 employees to up to thousands, Greenfeet help firms measure and manage their carbon emissions to reduce their output and improve sustainability by giving companies easy to configure accurate visibility of their carbon emissions, along with viable range of options as to how to go about reducing them. They provide an established, easy-to-use tool which allow businesses to upload their data and assist them in every stage of measuring, analysing and reporting to help focus future planning. Catering specifically towards SMEs with free trial access and low price, guidance available throughout. This can assist businesses in putting in place policies, goals and strategies. They provide a tangible action and software tool which anyone can access and help many organisations realise their goals are much closer than they can imagine, especially in the service sector. It's fantastic. Now, Lisa, I will start with you if that's okay. So the topic of today's conversation is all about carbon footprinting. So firstly, tell us a little bit about Greenfeet, what you're set up to do, what you're trying to achieve, and then also how and why organizations should understand their carbon footprint.
Sure. Well, yeah, as you mentioned there, Greenfeet is a software platform, and the aim is to enable companies of all different sizes to easily and quickly, really efficiently implement an effective sustainability policy in a really cost-effective way. So that looks like, I guess, firstly calculating your carbon footprint, then setting some goals around sustainability, then implementing some reduction initiatives, offsetting if needs be, and eventually reporting. So we do this really quickly. I guess the end-to-end experience can happen within a week. And the aim is to just give access to companies, as I said, of all sizes to implementing a sustainability policy and taking away, I suppose, the traditionally overwhelming nature of trying to implement a sustainability policy without really having, for want of a better phrase, without having a clue about how to go about it. Why is carbon footprinting so important? Well, it's the first step in implementing a sustainability policy. At Greenfeet, the motto that we have is you can't manage what you can't measure. So measuring is crucial when it comes to really understanding where you're coming from and trying to get to where you want to be, essentially. So carbon footprinting essentially means that you're trying to become measure your environmental impact in terms of global warming. So what you want to do is gather information with relation to your business activities that produce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and use them to calculate your total emission output for a particular year. And that information can come from things like utility bills or business travel information, employee commute patterns. So that's your starting point. There are so many reasons as to why you should carbon footprint. I'll give a rundown of a few. In practice, I suppose most of the companies that come to us, their team leadership simply decides that they'd like to be good corporate citizens, take more social responsibility, and they really just want to put sustainability at the heart of what they do, which is amazing and very crucial given the current situation that we're in. In some cases, it's mandated. As we know, the UK has been a huge leader in terms of driving the goal to reach net zero. And already some companies, quoted companies and large companies within the UK are already mandated to report. I feel like if you're a smaller company and you're working with larger companies, it's also very, very beneficial to report. And it can be good for the bottom line of the company, because if you're carbon footprinting and you're trying to figure out where you want to go in terms of sustainability, in terms of your customers at the moment, there's a huge demand for customers to, they're seeking out sustainable companies. Otherwise, you're looking at employee morale and retention. It can be really, really good for that. And there are many studies that show that with younger employees in particular, they can be really influenced by a company's sustainability profile in terms of their decision to work there. I could go on and on. There are, requirements in terms of investor communities when, particularly with the growth of ESG funds at the moment, they're looking for companies who are sustainable and a sustainable profile and a good sustainable profile at that. And also if you're a company that's applying for government tenders, then there's an onus on you to become sustainable, or at least present some sort of sustainability policy for the future. So we find that there are so many different reasons why you should carbon footprint, but in terms of Greenfeet in practice, we find that, if you're a larger company, the likes of Amazon or Google, you have these huge sustainability budgets or green teams or sustainability officers within the company that, make this easy in terms of resources, budget, and effort. But if you're a smaller company like the ones that we deal with, it can often be a single employee or a green team, a small green team of voluntary employees within that company that are trying to carry this out. And if you're at the start of this process and you're trying to figure out how to do it, it can be incredibly overwhelming. So what we're trying to do is to break it all down, simplify the entire process. But I guess the important takeaway from this question, from my perspective, is that the carbon footprint is only the first step in the process. There's a lot to come afterwards, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It could be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lisa. I mean, certainly that feeling of overwhelming, I can definitely relate to when Woking Borough Council declared its climate emergency and we suddenly had to figure out what we were going to do. I certainly felt that weight of overwhelmed on my shoulders, and I know many of the officer group did as well. Particularly, as you were just saying, even within our council, a lot of the people that had been working on the sustainability agenda before we declared a climate emergency were doing it just voluntarily as part of their role because they were passionate about it. So yeah, definitely, I can relate in the council perspective for what you're saying. Now, Lucy, I'll come to you next, if that's okay. So, firstly, again, tell us a little bit about what CDP does. And then if you wouldn't mind telling us why you think organizations, regardless of whether they're large or small, whether they're in services or manufacturing, whether they're local governments or charities, why do you think it's important that they should understand their impact on the environment?
Sure. So hi everyone, my name is Lucy. I've already had a lovely introduction, but I am the Senior Manager within the City, States and Regions Department at CDP, serving Europe, Middle East and Africa. And CDP is a non-profit that runs the world's only global environmental disclosure system for both subnational governments and companies. And actually the marriage of that data unlocks a lot of opportunities for collaboration and mutually reinforcing agenda around sustainability that I think we'll pick up on a bit later. But this platform enables companies and their supply chains, as well as cities, states and regions, to measure and manage their environmental impacts. And although my focus is supporting local government officials in disclosing their environmental activities and their impact and taking action to reduce climate risks, a lot of what I will say today is relevant to all entities. And I guess CDP, we pride ourselves on working with this range of stakeholders, but also people at different stages of their climate awareness. So the CDP reporting mechanism is really enables a journey for reporting organizations. They can report privately in the first year if they like, and as they go through and develop over time, that is rewarded in our scoring methodology as well. So we sort of create this system which hopefully ratchets up ambition over time and rewards as our entities move through their sustainability journeys. And of course, this has a multitude of benefits for local citizens and also for your business operations, which Lisa has already brilliantly referred to. And I think what's quite nice is that these two approaches, although CDP's platform is not a carbon footprinting tool, these are really complementary. So carbon footprinting is the essential first step. And the CDP reporting portal absolutely requires an understanding and evidence of that carbon footprinting process. And in addition to that, we also ask questions relating to governance structures. What strategies are in place? What policies are in place? What targets are in place? And understanding sort of action happening across a broader range of environmental areas, including waste and water, forests, consumption patterns. And I think our framework, as well as encouraging cities through our scoring system, it provides in and of itself a framework for action and aspiration. You can take the questionnaire and assume, all right, well, let's convert, what does this look like converted into an action plan for me? So it's not just about the scoring, it's creating a mechanism for cities and for businesses to think about how they could do things better. And this structure supports them in doing that. And as we've already heard, yes, measurement leads to better management. And for CDP, this hopefully also then influences policy change, because all the data that we collect, we share with a broad range of stakeholders who can change things on a more systemic level. And for those completing it, that's not just co-benefits in terms of carbon emissions, but it's also economic resilience, it's also health and well-being. So really important government mandates that are actually all interconnected and mutually reinforcing. So I would definitely advocate for people on the call to have a look at our website, to have a look at the resources available. There's lots of reports that summarize the data collected from corporate reporting and also from local government reporting. And I think, some more of those benefits in terms of reporting to CDP, well, you get to join a variety of projects and local networks. So, for example, in the cities team, we partner with the likes of Global Covenant of Mayors, C40, ICLEI, and this data is catalyzed between these partnerships so that we're all accessing the information, the best kind of information, and providing services to our disclosures to help them improve over time. You also get access to a range of best practice and knowledge resources, whether it's reports and case studies, as I've mentioned, or webinars and workshops. We have an open data portal so that you can access insights and learn what peers are doing and benchmark your progress. As I've mentioned, there are these opportunities to create partnerships between public and private sectors. So we have a finance project called Matchmaker. We also have a project called City Business, CBCA, City Business Climate Action, and a whole range of events. But critically, it's also about transparency and accountability. So how are you demonstrating, ideally publicly, what you're doing in terms of your environmental governance? And what steps are you making to improve your data quality over time? So yes, maybe I'll pause there.
Thank you. Yeah, some really interesting stuff there. I want to pick up on one thing that you were speaking about there, Lucy, and I'll come to Lisa with the question. So Lucy has talked about this being a journey towards net zero, starting with the first step being footprinting. Now, from that first step perspective, Lisa, what are the types of things that the people that are listening to this, the organizations, the individuals, should start to consider in advance or when they're starting to calculate their carbon footprint?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'll try and give a simple overview of the process and what you need to consider when doing it. So as I mentioned, carbon footprinting involves gathering data on your business activities, what we refer to as activity data that produce emissions. And this is all gathered together and added up to, I suppose, in a simple phrase to produce your estimate of a carbon footprint for that year. So I think firstly, it's important to mention that at Greenfeet, we follow the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard when calculating a company's carbon footprint, which is quickly becoming the de facto standard for this process. So we talk about activity data, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol breaks this data down into lots of different categories. So initially, they break it down into 3 different scopes. So to give you an overview quickly, scope one is basically at a very basic level any fuel that you burn. So occurs from sources that are owned or controlled by your company. So for example, think of fuel that you're using to heat your buildings or that's going into your cars. Scope two emissions are essentially they occur from the purchase of electricity, cooling, heating, or steam. And then scope three accounts for everything else in a nutshell. So the greenhouse gas protocol again breaks this down, scope three emissions, into 15 different categories, which I don't think I need to name right now. But just to give you an idea, they include purchased goods and services, things like business travel, things like employee commutes. So I guess the first thing you need to consider when you're deciding that you want to estimate your carbon footprint is you need to pick a year or a baseline year for the first carbon footprint that you're going to carry out, whenever that may be. And the next thing you want to do is identify those emissions that we talked about in terms of scope. So where are your emissions coming from? Lay it all out so that you can simplify the process for yourself. Then I guess, as I said, in principle this process is quite easy. But the complicated thing that we find for people that are coming to Greenfeet to look to have this process done for them is that they stumbled when they reached the emissions factor process. So you need to be able to take these emissions that you've gathered the data. You need to be able to translate these activity data. So for example, think of an electricity bill that's measured in units of kilowatt hours. That then needs to be translated into emissions, which are recorded in tons or kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So we find all the time that this is the biggest problem that we find that companies come face to face with when trying to carry out their carbon footprint. And our software has hundreds and hundreds of different calculators built in that enable this process to be really quick and easy. I mentioned emission factors, so I'll briefly give you an overview. Emission factors are published by different governments around the world on an annual basis. They can be found in published databases. And in the UK, DEFRA, or the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, they publish a detailed list of emission factors every year, which can be applied to all sorts of different things, from waste and water usage, as Lucy mentioned, right down to different modes of transport. So basically, that's how you come up with your initial carbon footprint. As I said, and as I think we're all going to stress today, the carbon footprint is the very first step in this. We'll often find that, again, as I mentioned before, this is an easy process for larger companies who can hire somebody to do this for them. But when an employee is a voluntary employee and they're faced with hundreds of different emission factors based on different locations and trying to pull it all together, it can be very, very overwhelming. So what we do at Greenfeet is simplify this process with our calculators and help and guide companies along with that process to make it easier for them, and provide guidance and advice wherever it's needed.
Thank you for that, Lisa. Lucy, is there anything that you would add to that list of considerations?
In terms of carbon footprinting itself, so this is something I spent a lot of time doing in a former life. I mean, one of the things that we often advised, and I don't know if Lisa might disagree with this, I'd be interested to know, is don't necessarily focus on measuring all that you possibly can measure if you're not actually placed or positioned to do anything about it. So, you might want to, you've got two sort of areas to organize yourself. One, where you're actually making the most impact, and two, what's in your control and what's in your influence and what's in neither. So I used to do a lot of carbon footprinting with the sort of entertainment industry. And there would be obvious things like energy consumption, which was a key impact and you had control over. Perfect. That's a great place to start thinking about a management plan. But other areas like audience travel were a very substantial area, but actually much less levers for change making. So it kind of, those questions I think might help organizations think about their prioritization as well. And sometimes it's best to concentrate on one thing and get it really right first, and then think about, so what have I learned from that process and how do I apply it to a wider range of impacts? Because I think with, the 3 scopes, you're basically, it's a really broad variety, of impacts to start considering. And I think it's good to think of a process on how you're going to work your way through that.
I think that's really good advice, actually. I mean, Lisa's already spoken about it can feel very overwhelming when you're starting this journey and you feel like you've got to be able to do everything, and you feel like you've got to get your entire carbon footprint to absolute zero as quickly as you possibly can, and that weight of pressure that comes with it is very, very difficult. So breaking it down into those very small, very manageable chunks, looking at the things that you can control, what you can influence and what you simply can't. We've had to do that as a borough as well. So when we've looked at our carbon footprint, things like cars going along the motorway through our borough, there's very little that we can actually do about that because we don't know where their point of origin is, we don't know where their destination is, we don't know how many people are in that vehicle, so there's very little that we can do about it. But journeys within our own communities of people commuting backwards and forwards to the station or their place of work, taking their children to school, going to the shops, there are things that we can do about that that are within our sphere of control and within our sphere of influence. So we focus on that. Now, I speak to a lot of businesses and I speak to a lot of organizations. The questions that I get asked the most are, where do I start? So, clearly you start with working out that carbon footprint and understanding the manageable chunks that you can and can't influence and control. The next step for me is about, looking at what you can control and setting your target and your objective. So, Lucy, staying with you, what advice would you give to the audience in terms of setting targets and how to then go about achieving?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and something that we're looking at in great detail at the moment. So we're participating. I would definitely recommend having a look at this campaign called Race to Zero. And Race to Zero is the UN-backed global campaign rallying non-state actors, which include companies, cities, regions, financial and educational institutions, for example, to take really rigorous and immediate action to halve global emissions by 2030. And all members are committed to do the same, pretty much, overarching goal of reducing emissions across all scopes in line with the Paris Agreement. And that means having a science-based target. And one of the things, so at the moment, we're really promoting following a science-based target aligned methodology as a really critical way of establishing target. We see a lot, particularly in the local government sphere, these political ambitions around net zero targets. I see you smiling there, Gregor. Which is amazing. It's a great first step. Of course, you want to get that political ambition to citizens, and I'm not undermining what a significant process it can take to get to that point. However, the next step is to ensure that target is aligned with the science, and that you have a plan that is actually going to drive you and take you towards that target. And it's actually not just a case of having your big 2050 or your 2040 or your 2030 target. It's also about having interim targets as well. So this is something that's really key to our methodology, particularly next year, is making sure our sort of highest scoring entities not only have their long-term political ambition, but they have these interim targets, which are really core to the SBT methodology. And furthermore, that within that, you're thinking about, what is my absolute emissions reduction target? So it's really easy, again, to have your big kind of flashy, cool target and not to not which is often you know, your net zero target, and within that not to differentiate what is part of actual reduction and what is part of your offsetting. Now, I think we know with net zero targets that there is always going to be a proportion of offsetting, because to have zero emissions is frankly to not exist. So we know that offsetting is going to be a core part of this, but it's really critical to differentiate what is offsetting and what is actual reduction, because that is where we need to also prioritize. If all of us just simply offset using traditional mechanisms, we would not be in a better place. So we have to focus on reduction and efficiency, and for that to be really clearly articulated.
Thank you for that, Lucy. And I particularly like that phrase, to have zero emissions is to not exist, because I think we all have to be realistic with ourselves. We cannot simply just go to total zero and by reducing our emissions. We have to offset, because otherwise we're not going to be achieving the other things that we've set out to achieve. Lisa, coming back to you. So once organizations have set those targets, and please feel free to add anything to what Lucy has just said if you want to, but once organizations have set their targets, they've got their absolute, they've got their interims, what do you think the next best steps for them on that journey towards net zero are?
I guess, well, Lucy covered at a high level how, you might go about reducing emissions and why it's so important. And, I'm reinforcing the fact that it's a journey, and the carbon footprint is the first step. But maybe I could give some insight into basic practices that you can implement and things that you can do to reduce emissions within an organization, and following on in this process towards becoming more sustainable or driving sustainability within that company. So we obviously we carry out the carbon footprint, and then the next step is for a company to set goals. The next step is to look at reduction initiatives. So how do you reduce your emissions within your company? Well, the first thing that's really important is to look at your services and providers that you're receiving. If you're working with services or providers who are carbon neutral, then that's going to go a long way in terms of helping you to reduce your own emissions within your company. You can look at things like switching energy sources. So you might want to heat your buildings using green energy, or implementing that. You might look at employee initiatives, which at a really basic level are actually really important and very effective ways of encouraging your workforce to become involved in reducing your emissions. So something that we do is send out employee surveys to the companies that we're working with in terms of their employee commute patterns. And we find that this is a really great way of engaging people, one, within the company, but two, of also reducing emissions, because as a follow-on, you can implement initiatives to encourage your employees to bike to work instead of driving or walk to work. So those sort of basic initiatives are really effective. You could also look at things like introducing electric vehicles instead of the fleet that you currently have. But it's important to note that in practice, we actually dealt with a company last week who had purchased an entire fleet of electric vehicles without having carried out a carbon footprint process first. And they realized that afterwards that they accounted for less than 5% of the total amount of emissions that they were actually responsible for. So it was actually turned out to be a really bad investment. And Lucy, you mentioned in terms of, what you're deciding to count, I suppose, in the carbon footprinting process, and, not being too specific, or, counting the emissions of things that you really can't control. So this was a really important lesson for that company, because had they carried out the carbon footprint, they realized that it was less than 5% of their emissions. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol actually maintains that this concept of materiality. So the rule of thumb is that when you're counting emissions, if it accounts for less than this sort of cutoff of 5%, then it's probably not worth counting. So yeah, again, there are so many different ways to reduce your emissions within your company, but I just cannot stress the carbon footprint is the essential first piece in the puzzle.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I was just taking a note there. It's really interesting what you said about that, the organisation, the EV fleet. I actually know of an organisation. They're not based in Woking, but they did a employee commute survey and realised that the vast majority, something like 80% of their employees, were commuting about 20 miles to get into the office every morning, and all of their employees tended to live in the same place. So they were all living around one town. So what the organisation did was they moved their office and they took their office closer to where all of their staff lived. And actually, they then went from having, let's say, 20 people commute 20 miles to having 2 people commute 20 miles. And so they cut their carbon footprint massively as a result of just doing that, which I thought was a really interesting case study. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is about the report itself. So let's assume the organisation has calculated their carbon footprint, they've worked out what their targets are going to do, they've created an action plan. Lucy, I'll start with you on this one. So do you think that organisations, regardless of what aspect of business or whatever they're in, do you think they should report their carbon footprint and publish their plans and put them into the public domain?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a really essential part of good governance. And I think it, creates a further accountability mechanism. That said, I have seen many policies and strategies supposedly prepared for the public, and they often do leave a little to the imagination. So I think there's something that can be used internally and a version of that that can be made public. So, for example, it's obvious to say that, overarching commitments and targets, great to have those in the public domain, as long as, they're decipherable by whomever your stakeholders are. I think in terms of action plans, what I always advise is, you have a working document to really negotiate what your action plan is, who needs to be involved, what are the timelines, when does this information get updated, how do you know you're successful? That to me is a live, iterative document that ideally needs to be shared by, the group of people who are feeding into it. Now, should that be made public? Well, potentially, depending on the kind of organization. But I would also say, your public document is maybe what your effectively your higher level strategy, the sort of the top line of that information that maybe is your strategic objectives over, a 3-year period. The actual detail of that is something I would consider to be offline, because I think it's a really critical juncture that piece is what's live. It's what's keeping you on track. You want to visit it regularly. You want to update it regularly. You want to be working on it like it's a live, moving piece of information. And I think when those two things get conflated, progress is either too slow, or there is information that's not interesting enough for the public to actually engage with, meaningfully. So I think there are kind of two versions of the strategy part of this.
Thank you. Now, Lisa, I want to ask you the same question, but in a slightly different way, if that's okay. So, from your experience, do many of the organisations that come to you avoid publishing their targets, their report, because of fear of failure? And if so, how do you help them to overcome that?
I guess we find that most of the companies that we work with will report in some shape or form, and maybe this is exactly what Lucy was talking about. But I guess we would encourage them to do so and try to guide them as to how to do that properly and effectively. I guess the most important thing that we would stress is, and I don't know how Lucy feels about this, but would be that your creating some sort of accountability by yourself for yourself by publishing your goals and your aims and what you hope to achieve in terms of your sustainability policy. And by doing that, you're making a public commitment to sustainability, and this has transparency built into it, and the greenhouse gas protocol maintains that transparency is one of the most important aspects of GHG accounting in the first place. So I think that in terms of reporting, we definitely would encourage companies to report, but as Lucy said, to do it in an effective way and to use the public versus private, I guess I completely agree. You want to use this private sort of sustainability policy as your working document, but you want to set realistic aims and goals in terms of your sustainability policy and where it's going to end up. So therefore, it's really, really important to firstly delve into exactly what your carbon footprint is. I keep going back to this, but it's so important to set realistic goals and to know exactly where you're going to go and how achievable that is. And that's something that we would hammer home to all the companies that we deal with. Don't set crazy goals and expectations to look good to the public or to your stakeholders, your board members, your customers. Make sure that what you're promising is realistic and achievable.
Thank you for that, Lisa. Just on that subject, I get emailed a lot asking me to sign up to some form of carbon pledge, climate pledge, commit our council to various different types of legislation or pledges that happen to be out in the ether at any given time. What are your views on the different carbon and climate pledges and whether or not organisations should sign up to them? And I'll start with Lisa on that.
I guess I feel like making a carbon pledge is similar to reporting. There are so many different ways to do it. You can simply make a climate pledge on your website if you're a small company that doesn't want to go through a formal process, or else you can sign up to the likes of the carbonpledge.com or 1% for the planet. And I guess it depends really on the preference of the company and what makes sense for that business. Maybe you want to be part of a collective, so you'll sign up to the carbonpledge.com and we're pledging to be net zero by 2040, accelerating the drive towards net zero. Maybe you just want to be a lone warrior and do it by yourself. I guess, again, it comes back to being transparent and being realistic about the pledge that you're making. And that's what it all comes down to for us. It's really important to set realistic expectations before making that pledge, however or whatever or whenever you do that.
Lucy, what are your thoughts on carbon and climate pledges?
Absolutely. To echo everything that Lisa has said, there are numerous ways to engage with pledges and public commitments and campaigns. I think it's a choice, what makes sense for you and why. And maybe there is an element of being kind of choosy rather than saying, yeah, well, sign up to everything because there are hundreds and hundreds. Again, focusing on what makes sense for you as an organization and then really following through. By joining a given pledge that you're actually, it's not just about focusing on the political ambition, but it's what does it take to get us there? What are the resource needs? How do we organize ourselves over time? How do we be accountable to that pledge, not just being a name in this campaign? Through the CDP platform, a range of partners that we work with, cities and entities can actually join various sort of affiliate pledges through our dashboard. And this means that you're not actually double reporting. So in the case of Race to Zero that I mentioned earlier, entities using the CDP platform, pledge on the website, they indicate on our reporting portal that they're part of that pledge. And then the data collected anyway through our reporting mechanism is then fed into that pledge. So it's not duplicating the effort, it's better leveraging the information already collected. And that is very sort of, I guess, favourable to our entities as well.
Yeah, I would echo those points. I mean, from a council perspective, I get invited to sign up to a variety of pledges on a regular basis, and my immediate response has always been, firstly, we don't knee jerk into anything. So just because something is popular and is in the public mindset doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to immediately sign up to it. And the other thing is that we have to make sure that it's relevant. So relevant to us, relevant to what we're trying to do, and who we are as a council and to our residents. And I would stress that for organisations as well. Any pledge that you do sign up to, make sure it is relevant to you, to your organisation, and to the mission that you're setting out to try and achieve. Now, I want to give some time for our audience to ask some questions, and if anybody has some, please use the chat function now, and we'll create some time towards the end to go through your questions. One final question from me for the time being. So for both of you, and we'll start with Lucy first. What are the two key things that you would like our audience to take away from this session today, and how do you feel that your organisation can support that?
Well, for the businesses or those representing business, it would certainly be to go and have a look on the CDP website, have a look at the assets provided. And what you can do, which is, I think, really helpful, is see an offline version of the questionnaire, dependent on what your entity is. Obviously, I've talking about the city's questionnaire, but you can also view the corporate questionnaire as just a sort of PDF document, which is a really useful process in going through, seeing what kind of data and information is requested, and think about, okay, what would it take for me to get here? Who would need to be involved in this process? Can I start ready for the disclosure period in 2022, which I would definitely recommend doing. And maybe also haven't, we produce a lot of assets with all this data. And I think that's a really critical point, because, we are trying to change things on a systems level. And that means being able to collate and synthesize all the data, and get it to policymakers, get it to decision makers, but also help us see what we're collectively contributing to. So maybe I can share a couple of links to some particularly useful reports, and you can actually see how this data is being used in practice, and see what you would actually be contributing to in that sort of bigger picture sense.
Thank you. And Lisa, what would your two key takeouts be, and how can Greenfeet support that?
I guess my two key takeaways would be that it's not ever too early for companies to start thinking about sustainability and to start implementing a sustainability policy. The second takeaway is that it doesn't need to be a complicated, overwhelming process. How can Greenfeet help with it? Well, we simplify the process essentially. Just to give you a quick overview, when you arrive at our platform, you sign up, you can instantly use our calculators right there and then. We'll set up a getting started call. We'll walk you through the information you're going to need to gather to calculate your carbon footprint. Then our emissions experts will take over. They'll calculate your carbon footprint for you. Once this is done, we'll then work with you to I suppose, examine your carbon footprint and then set in place reduction initiatives, or where emission reductions are unavoidable, we'll help you with offsets. And finally, we'll help you report. So really, we're here to help with the end-to-end process. And again, I'll direct people to our website, greenfeet.com. If anybody has any questions, or we can help with anything or offer guidance or advice, please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I mean, I think for me, just listening to this conversation, the sort of the takeouts that I would probably take from it, and I hope our audience will take from it, is that this is a journey. It's going to begin with some very small steps. Some of them might feel a little bit scary, but actually when you break them down, you're not alone. There's a lot of help and resources available to help you do it. The key is to just start taking those steps, however little they may be, and then work to get bigger and build and build and build until eventually you get to the point where you're reaching that net carbon zero stage. Now, I want to move on to a little bit of Q&A. I see that we've had a question. I'll come to that in just a second. But before we get to that, we have a second poll for you, which is, has your business made any changes to reduce its carbon emission? And you can answer either lots of changes, some changes, or we haven't made any changes yet. And if you could just very quickly answer that right now, and I will have a quick look at the question that has been submitted. So the question that has been submitted is, can you explain a bit more about carbon offsetting and what is acceptable? And I see Lucy nodding her head along quite nicely there, so I will start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also very keen to hear Lisa's perspective on this. I guess there are a few principles to follow. It's not the easiest of terrains to navigate carbon offsetting. I have once been a party to writing a report on it, and honestly, by the end, I did consider, should we just say the report is carbon offsetting, don't do it, because there are so many political challenges. There's a lot of cases of money not actually going to the right places, making the right impact. So you want to ensure that if you are doing an external carbon offsetting scheme, you're following, you're looking for gold standard projects that are absolutely delivering measurable outcomes and following, the sort of carbon offsetting best practice frameworks. There's definitely a lot of nefarious activities that happen under the guise of carbon offsetting. That said, you can also think of other ways to, negate that impact. And there's another interesting model called carbon insetting, which is basically where you would do your carbon footprint. You would look at the price of that carbon footprint, which is relatively easy to do, but again, this is a slightly problematic terrain as tons of carbon tend to be priced far, far, far lower than their actual impact, social and ecological impact. But excluding that for a second, and then actually making that investment in an internal activity that is reducing your carbon emissions. And this is also being looked at in terms of local government as well. If that's something you're interested in, I can put you in contact with the relevant organisation. But you can basically follow. There's several guides that I can dig out. That's sort of a decision-making tree that also helps you navigate what you're actually trying to do with your carbon offsetting. Are you interested in also connecting it to corporate social responsibility goals as well as maybe environmental? Or if you're looking at an environmental project, how are you stress testing it, making sure it's delivering what it says it's going to deliver? For example, everyone loves tree planting, but this is only sustainable if those trees are actually going to be managed in the long term. And if carbon insetting is an option, and maybe that interests you, and can you create a ring-fenced fund to actually make internal investments in carbon reduction mechanisms that wouldn't be happening anyway, which is actually quite a critical point when it comes to carbon accounting. So that's my sort of overall response.
Thank you, Lucy. Lisa, what's your view on offsetting?
Yeah, completely agree with Lucy. There are cases, there are certain situations whereby, emissions are unavoidable in terms of maybe thinking about business travel. So offsets need to be looked at. Unfortunately, not all offsets are equal, as Lucy mentioned. And the carbon offset market can be a hazard area. It's really difficult to verify them. It can be just a really, really tricky process and hard to navigate. We actually work with a company, we've partnered with them called Nori, who are an offsetting company. Generally, you'll find that most offsets are reduction or avoidance offsets. Nori is focused on removal, carbon removal, through regenerative farming. So we find that they're really highly trusted quality offsets that we would stand by. So there are different options, as Lucy said, to look at. It's just a case of being very careful about how you're going about it and being very thorough in terms of your research when offsetting.
Yeah, and I would add to that, offsetting can never be a substitute to reduction. It needs to be something that you do in order to advance your carbon journey to net zero, but it shouldn't ever be an excuse not to reduce. I at the moment I can't afford to buy an electric vehicle, so I offset my carbon from my car. But I know that at some point in the future I will have an electric vehicle, and then the two things will go hand in hand. We're also, as a borough council, we're looking at opportunities for organisations within our area to offset within our borough. So we're looking to create schemes that will allow businesses and organisations within our boundaries to offset their carbon within our boundaries. But more on that to come shortly. We've had a really good question in the chat from Katie Osborne, and I want to come into this. We've only got a couple of minutes left. So she says, I'm encountering real reluctance with individuals, not the business leaders, getting involved with the Green Initiative. Generally, people agree that it's a good thing in practice, but in practice, it's hard work. Feels a bit like GDPR woes, I understand that one. Any tips to encourage individuals to get on board, please? And Lisa, I'll start with you on that one.
I would say, employee initiatives are the way to go initially. Again, breaking down the barriers, making it not seem like an overwhelming thing to drive sustainability within the company. Figure out what interests your employees and where they might be interested in reducing emissions and doing it not to sound twee, but in a fun way. Employee initiatives, like I said, biking to work, walking to work, create a competition, make it competitive within the company, and you'll find that people will bite. And really, I think just uncomplicating it and just breaking it down is the way to go. And being enthusiastic about it. It is a fun thing. It's a great thing that people are trying to do in terms of sustainability. It's where we need to be. It's where we need to be going. So being enthusiastic about it and just keep fighting on, just keep encouraging, and eventually we find in practice that employees will absolutely get on board.
And Lucy, what about from your experience?
Yeah, very similar to Lisa. Absolutely empower your workforce, find out what people are interested in. Environmental sustainability is obviously a really broad topic, but things that tend to get people engaged might be to do with nature, or it might be to do with food. Everyone loves coming together over food, and it's a great platform to talk about sustainability issues. Celebrate and reward success, even the small things, and try not, as much as possible, don't make it an extra on people's roles and their time. So really think about how you're rewarding people's contribution, or how you're actually embedding it within people's roles and responsibilities. Because I think this is when we see a lot of organizational issues to do with, burnout, or people, the agenda just not moving forward. It's another thing people have to do. And I hate the idea it would be thought of as something similar to GDPR. So I think that injection of creativity and humor and camaraderie is really critical.
Well, thank you for that. I'm very conscious that we've only got a few seconds left, so I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Lisa and Lucy for giving their time and coming along and talking with us today, sharing their knowledge, their expertise, and also sharing the role that their organisations can play in helping support you as you start your journey and progress along your journey towards net carbon zero. We as a Borough Council have a whole load of opportunities for businesses to engage within our climate emergency and for us to engage within your climate action plans. So You can sign up for the Climate Emergency and for the Business Matters newsletters. We're looking to do a series of events like this ongoing, so more climate conversations in the future. And we're about to launch a portal to enable to engage our business communities as part of our local deliberative processes that we've previously announced. So please keep an eye out for them. Please engage, please involve, and please join me in thanking Lisa and Lucy just one last time for giving up their time today to speak with us and share their knowledge. Thank you both. And thank you everybody for attending. And it's bang on 1 o'clock. So at that point, thank you for a wonderful conversation. And we'll speak to you all very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lucy. That was fantastic.